Part 27. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guangguanggongzi. Chapter 261. The Crown Prince is Very Fierce. Chapter 64 of Hidden Dragon Scale Shadow. Chapter 64 Insight into the overall situation. At noon, the main courtyard in the middle of the Xiao mansion was guarded by more than 10 retainers in different clothes. The maids and servants were all told to stay away. Most of the entire Xiao family in Huainan. All the guests are gathered here. At this moment, the study room of the Xiao mansion is probably no less tightly guarded than the imperial study room in the imperial city. In the large study room, Prime Minister Xiao Chuang had not yet taken off his official robe, sitting quietly behind the desk with a cup of hot tea. 3 staff members of the Xiao family were sitting in the study. Among them was Hua Jingting, the chief manager of the Xiao family in Huainan, and they were all Xiao family's confidants. At home, Xiao Qi, who serves as the head of the Xiao family, has a higher status than her brother Xiao Chuang. However, as the eldest brother is like a father, it is naturally impossible for him to sit at the head of the throne. He can only sit elegantly on the Taishi chair next to the desk. Telling the key to this visit to Beijing. After the dragon locking gu was stolen, I have been sending people to secretly investigate, but unfortunately nothing has been found. There are few people in the world who can completely wipe out their whereabouts under the eyes of me, Mrs. Xiao. The poison that was poisoned by Prince Su the year before last, it has not yet been determined whether it came from my Xiao family, but it is irrelevant. The important thing is why Prince Su was infected with the dragon lock gu. Xiao Chuang listened quietly, because they were all Xiao's helmsmen, and they spoke without reservation. I have long sensed that something is wrong with the situation. I guess that the Holy One is afraid of King Su's lineage and wants to cut down the vassal. However, the Holy One's mood and anger are not clear at the moment, so it is difficult to tell anything. Xiao Qi shook her head, with a bit of indifference in her eyes, and said softly, "This matter is by no means as simple as cutting down the vassalage King Su is plotting to unify is also nonsense." Oh! Several people in the study frowned slightly. Xiao Chuang rubbed his teacup and said softly, "If it's not to reduce the vassal status, what else could it be for?" Xiao Qi pondered for a moment and looked towards the direction of the imperial city. 10 years ago, King Suyu disobeyed and did not kill the entire Donghai Lu family, which made the Holy Emperor feel fearful. King Su holds the 2 states of Qin and Wei, which poses a great threat to Chang'an, but moving the capital to Luoyang will inevitably shake up the country. Judging from the skill shown by the emperor's succession, he will not choose to take this step back. Xiao Chuang thought about it for a moment. If it was the Holy Lord who made the move, this move would be too bad. If Su is killed, King Su will have to rebel. If King Su rebels, everything will be broken, and it is very likely that he will enter Chang'an. By then, the 6 kings will join Chang'an King Qin. Although King Su could be driven away and killed, the Song clan members in Chang'an city at that time, including the current emperor, must have died under King Su's sword. The emperor would never let the other 6 vassal kings have the idea of perishing with King Su. Let's reap the benefits of being a fisherman and create peace for the world. When the 6th dragon sees the legitimate rights, I'm afraid the chaos caused by King Su's rebellion will be more serious. Xiao Qi nodded. That's the problem. So King Su and even us all guessed that it was not the hand of the Holy Master, but someone else. But who this person is cannot be determined. Xiao Chuang nodded. That's true. Your Majesty treats Prince Su and Prince Su with impeccable words and actions. I'm afraid this is a trap set up by others. Xiao Qi smiled softly. It is indeed the plan set up by others. Since the previous dynasty, the Central Plains has been separatist with heavy troops. Although they are loyal to the court, the harm is obvious. Before Jiazi, our dynasty competed with Daqi for the world. In the end, at the beginning, it was difficult to move even an inch. Every time he attacked a state or county, he had to pay the price in blood. Even Emperor Xiaozong personally wore armor and went into battle to boost morale. And in the middle stage of the fight, when both sides were evenly matched, the pressure suddenly weakened. Basically, my grandfather and those generals and aristocratic families were in love with each other, and they spent more time sitting on the table than on the battlefield. More, I love Sadhu.com. Finally, they reached Guanzhong Road. Daqi's national strength was still there, and all the civil and military officials were there. However, the emperor of Daqi found that he had no usable soldiers. In the battle to break the country in Chang'an City, there were only 100,000 soldiers and horses to stop Dao's cavalry. After Xiao Qi said this, she stood up and looked at the map of Dao hanging in the study. Today's emperor has lofty ambitions and supports the literati to launch the imperial examination. He wants to reduce the military power of the powerful families, especially the generals. 10 years ago Iron Eagle's deer hunting is to scare the monkeys. Most of the small families are frightened, but there are still a few families with big businesses that are difficult to shake. My second brother must know who these families are. Xiao Chuang nodded lightly. After the current holy emperor succeeded to the throne, he humbly accepted advice and knew people were good at their duties. Everyone in the government and the public worshipped him. Even the 7 kings did not dare to make mistakes. It is difficult for those families to cause any trouble. Xiao Qi shook her head. You don't have to make trouble in the court. No matter how talented the holy emperor is, he only has 2 arms and 1 head, which is no more than half a life than a hard-working untouchable. He can't play chess. 1 sword splatters with blood on 5 moves. This game of chess is also useless. It's a win. After the words fell, several staff members and Xiao Chuang frowned and looked at each other. Xiao Chuang hesitated. I'm afraid this is a bit of a joke. If the king of a country was so easy to kill, he would have changed dynasties countless times. Xiao Qi smiled softly and sat back in her chair. This is the fact, but there must be variables. I rushed to the capital in a hurry, so I came over to keep an eye on it to prevent the Xiao family from getting the wrong son at the critical moment. Xiao Chuang was silent for a moment while holding the teacup, and said softly, Today's holy master is too tough. As a brother, I can only be cautious in my words and deeds. The launch of the imperial examination will actually be harmful to my Huainan Xiao family. Xiao Qi raised her hand and shook her head. The Xiao family, may also be chess pieces on the chessboard, rather than people watching chess. The first move is the first mistake. If the second brother assesses the situation too early and stands in the wrong position, Conglong's merit will be lost. If you get it, you may lose the entire Xiao family. Xiao Chuang took a breath and considered it carefully for a moment. What about the Lu family across the street? 10 years ago, Jinling Lu spoke for Donghai Lu and was reprimanded by His Majesty several times. Lu Cheng'an is not an incompetent person. He will definitely choose to wait and see until the dust settles. Second brother is the head of all officials. He must express his position at that time. Remember to think twice before acting. The study fell silent. After sitting for a while, several people nodded gently. Xiao Chuang breathed a sigh of relief and raised his hand and said, Xiao Qi, you have come all the way here. It is not easy to travel by boat and car. Go down and rest first. Tomorrow, we will have a family dinner and invite Prince Su. You can chat with him and see if you can find out anything. Although Xiao Qi ran thousands of miles, he was used to running around in Huainan. He did not look tired at all. Instead, he was very energetic. He nodded slightly, stood up, and walked out with the housekeeper to visit the descendants of the Xiao family living in the capital. Thank you for the reward of the world is not worth it. Thank you for the 10,000 reward from Nangong Zhuiao. It's still 12,000. The Chang'an volume is coming to an end. The calm before the storm seems a bit dull. Next week's update may not be as fast as this week. I will save some drafts to sort out the plot, but it won't be too slow. Thank you for your continued support. The Prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 262. In the afternoon, in the back house of Prince Su's mansion, 3 futons were placed in the garden. The weather was refreshing without the sun, and the surroundings were full of birds singing and the fragrance of flowers. Su Buling, Ning Yuhi, and Zhu Manzi were sitting on the futon in a triangle shape, meditating quietly. Su Buling himself was highly skilled in martial arts, and meditation was a way to regulate his energy and blood. He was already in samadhi, his back was straight and motionless, and only his hair was gently fluttering in the wind. Ning Yuhi put on his Taoist robe again. He was clean and neat. His hair was pinned with a wooden hairpin, and he had a somewhat dusty atmosphere. However, when he was at home, he did not need to jump around, and his chest was not tied with cloth. Tied up, wearing a belly band and a bulging skirt, it looks a bit like a ridge on the side and a peak on the side. Next to the two of them, Zhu Manzi was wearing a floral skirt. Her head was like a chicken pecking at rice. She closed her eyes and made a sound of hoo-hoo. She was obviously asleep. Ning Yuhi was always thinking about what happened last night. In fact, he couldn't meditate quietly. From time to time, he opened his eyes and looked at Su Buling, who was motionless, and then at Zhu Manzi, who was sleepy, and pursed his lips softly. I smiled. Actually, I really like days like this. It would be interesting to think that on the edge of the cliff of Changqing Temple, a master and 2 disciples were meditating facing the great mountains and rivers. One was very obedient and promising, while the other was naughty and did not practice well. Thinking of this, Ning Yuhi felt a little disappointed, because her other disciple Ning Qingyi was a little more serious than her in meditating and practicing. When the time came to meditate together, I am afraid that the most dishonest master would be her. Time passed little by little, and in the afternoon, Mrs. Lu walked in from the veranda carrying a food box. She called out softly from a distance, "Your Majesty." Su Buling opened his eyes, took a few deep breaths, and saw Ning Yuhi meditating seriously and Zhu Manzi lying on the lawn and falling asleep, which was a little funny. April was not afraid of catching a cold, so he did not wake up Xiao Manzi, who was sleeping very unladylikely, and quickly came outside the bedroom. Mrs. Lu was wearing a thin skirt with white flowers on a blue background, and her bun was arranged more meticulously than ever before. She held a food box in her hand, raised her eyes to look at the Zumanzi in the garden, frowned in confusion, and quietly approached Su Bulet and Ling Huiri asked in a low voice. "Ling how good is your Jianghu friend? Why do you lie on the ground and put up a big character, and it looks like sleeping?" The faint scent of Osman thus was refreshing. Su Buling easily put his arms around Mrs. Lu's shoulders and said mysteriously, "The secret skill in the world of martial arts, sleeping fist, don't look at her as if she is asleep. As long as she dares to get close, whoever dares to get close will. It's not a good idea." Mrs. Lu was dubious, frowned and thought for a moment, "Then you just walked past her." "Well, I am one of my own, so of course you won't hit me. Come into the house." "Oh." Mrs. Lu nodded, glanced at Ning Yuhi, and felt that that was what a master from this world should look like. However, she was not from the world, so naturally she was not easy to judge. She walked into the room, turned around and closed the door. "Miss Xiao came this morning. She is a very nice person. She can chat with me and is much more sensible than the Queen Mother. Mr. Xiao prepared a banquet and asked me to bring an invitation. You can come with me tomorrow. It's like getting to know each other." Su Buling didn't pay attention to this at all. He nodded and looked at the food box in Mrs. Lu's hand. "Did you bring me something delicious? Or some good wine?" Mrs. Lu gave a slightly angry look, sat down on the small soft couch in the bedroom, and opened the food box, which contained several small wine bottles. She took out one of them and handed it to Su Buling. This is the October White produced in the south of the Yangtze River. It is very famous in Jinling. Miss Yao brought it here along the way. You can try it. Su Buling continued with a smile, sat down next to Mrs. Lu, and looked at the rest. Are these all? Mrs. Lu smiled gently, with a hint of earnestness in her eyes. Didn't I give you a massage last time? You said I didn't do it well, so I went to learn from Master Ning for a while. I went there a few days ago. Taiyin Hospital, I asked for some royal medicine wine. It will definitely be effective. Let me try it for you. Queen. Su Buling nodded, and without Mrs. Lu's guidance, he honestly undressed and took off his belt, lying on the couch with his upper body naked, exposing his muscular back. Mrs. Lu had really studied her craft carefully recently. She rolled up her sleeves, knelt down at Su Buling's waist, then took out a small bottle and opened it, and the rich aroma of medicinal wine spread in the room. Su Buling sniffed, frowned, tilted his head and said, Saralan, golden cherry seeds, these are good for replenishing qi and blood, nourishing the kidneys and strengthening essence, right? Mrs. Lu raised her hand and slapped Su Buling on the back. She was not shy about this topic, but said seriously. The imperial doctor said that when you first recover from an injury or a serious illness, your qi and blood will inevitably be deficient. If you don't take good care of yourself and get rid of the root cause of the disease, it will be difficult to have children. You are not even old enough, and you don't even have a wife or concubine. If you ruin your body in my hands, I have no shame in going down to see your mother. Su Buling smiled helplessly and did not refuse. Anyway, it was nothing to make up for it. Mrs. Lu poured the medicinal wine into her palms and rubbed it on Su Buling's back a few times. Maybe it was because her posture and Ning Yu's teachings were wrong, so it was a little difficult to exert force. She hesitated for a moment and said softly, Ling don't move around. I'm giving you a massage. With a cold feeling on his back, Su Buling lay down and said with a chuckle, I'm not moving, Aunt Lu is just massaging her seriously. As soon as he finished speaking, Su Buling found Mrs. Lu standing on the small couch. He stood up, then his legs sank and he sat directly on his lap. Su Buling frowned, and his calm face became strange. Because of his sharp perception, he could clearly feel every bit of the contact surface, and even the outline of the camel toe seemed to be roughly felt. Cough. Su Buling coughed, and his face became uncomfortable. After enduring for a moment, he raised his head slightly and wanted to get up, but he was slapped on the back. Mrs. Lu's slightly stern voice came from behind. Don't move, otherwise I don't know how to press. Su Buling was extremely uncomfortable and couldn't lie down at all. He clenched his hands, and was hesitant to speak. He didn't know how to tell Mrs. Lu. Mrs. Lu didn't think anything of it. After all, this was to regulate the body. She had finally learned it. It was no different from holding Su Buling and sleeping with his clothes on when he couldn't move. Seeing Su Buling moving around, making her a little unstable, she frowned slightly and said, Ling what's wrong? Did I not press it well? No, it was very good. Aunt Lu is really very skillful. Then why are you moving around? A little heavy. Pa. A very strong slap on the back. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 263. Night falls quietly, and thousands of lights are lit in Chang'an City. The palace lanterns in Changle Palace were swaying. In the main hall of the palace, the Queen Mother was rarely leaning on the couch lazily. She was sitting upright, showing her posture as the mother of a country incisively and vividly. On the corridor between the palace pavilions, Xiao Qi and her maidservants walked slowly towards the main hall, looking straight ahead with a calm expression. However, Qiao Yi, who was leading the way, was so timid that she didn't dare to show her presence. Even the surrounding maids were silent, which is enough to see that. How strong is the aura of this eldest lady who sits in charge of the Xiao family as a woman. Because she was entering the palace of the Queen Mother, Xiao Qi was followed by a tall and strong woman, who was even taller than the man. Xiao Qi herself has a pragmatic temperament, knows people well and uses them well. Her requirements for her subordinates have never been about appearance. The maid's appearance is far more useful than Qiao Yi, who is thin and weak. She always keeps her with her. Tap tap tap. Footsteps passed through the corridor outside the palace, and it seemed that there was only this orderly footsteps in the entire Changle palace. The Queen Mother's face was obviously a little reserved, but she acted calm and dignified, folded her hands on her waist, and waited quietly. Soon, Xiao Qi, who was wearing a long black dress, walked into the main hall and bowed in front of the couch with a graceful greeting. See the Queen Mother, her movements were impeccable. No gift. The Queen Mother smiled and raised her hand to signal the sister she had not seen for several years to sit down. Xiao Qi straightened up and tilted her head slightly. Everyone get out. Yes. The palace maids nodded quickly and ran out in unison, closing the door. The Queen Mother's almond-shaped eyes widened slightly, and her face was obviously a bit dissatisfied. She frowned and said, "You are so arrogant, you are shouting and drinking in my room." Xiao Qi curled her lips, sat down next to the Queen Mother, raised her hand and pinched the Queen Mother's face. "How many days have you been the Queen Mother and you have forgotten your elders and children? The movements are not too outrageous, but rather intimate. After all, they are sisters from the same mother." The Queen Mother frowned in anger, slapped away the hand that was squeezing her face, and sat further to the side. "You are so old, but you still move your hands and feet and sit still." Xiao Qi leaned on the soft couch, leaning on the armrest with her elbows, and tilted her head to carefully look at her biological sister whom she had not seen for a long time. "We haven't seen each other for so many years. I just came to the palace to visit you when I arrived in the capital. You didn't even call me sister." The Queen Mother pursed her lips, a little unhappy. "You were born half a quarter of an hour earlier than me, why should I call you sister? Now that I am the Queen Mother, you must understand the rules, and there is no etiquette at all." Xiao Qi knew the sister's temperament best. She didn't believe at all that she knew etiquette and rules in private. She tilted her head and looked at the solemn main hall and said softly, "Just cleaned up today." The Queen Mother frowned slightly, tilted her head and looked around a few times. After confirming that there was nothing wrong, she said calmly, "It's always been like this." Xiao Qi raised her eyebrows and looked at the place where the low table and heater were originally. After a copper stove has been used for a long time, the wood used for the floor will deform no matter how good it is. Judging from the position of the stove, there should be a table above it. As the Queen Mother, you usually sit on the floor to eat and extend your legs under the table. The Queen Mother's face stiffened, and she turned her head to look around. Under the dim candle light, the light reflected from the floor was indeed slightly distorted. You couldn't notice it unless you looked carefully. She looked slightly surprised. "Are you a dog?" Xiao Qi smiled softly, sat sideways on the soft couch, and looked at the Queen Mother carefully. "You and I are sisters, and we are both daughters. I used to think you were young, but we have been in the palace for 10 years. I know how much we have suffered, and I won't tell you anything." When the Queen Mother heard this, a trace of trance flashed in her eyes. She pursed her lips, resumed her usual sitting posture, and leaned on the soft couch lazily. "I thought you had no humanity at all. You can't even imagine the things I've suffered. I'm locked in a cage like a bird, living in a place as big as my hand. I can't make any trouble all year round. Even being angry is a luxury, because no one competes with me at all, unlike you, strategizing in Huainan, getting whatever you want, you should have suffered this crime. Xiao Qi sighed softly, got a little closer, and held the Queen Mother's hand. One of you and I are destined to enter the palace, and you grab Xian and Bakuai by yourself. The Queen Mother looked a little annoyed in her eyes and pulled her hand away. You didn't tell me at the time that Su Danking was going to paint you. I wanted to fight with you before I went to grab it. If you told me that you would enter the palace, Xiao Qi shook her head, her usually calm and beautiful face showing a bit of helplessness. Being born into a noble family, you have no choice but to do what you want. It doesn't matter if I enter the palace, but after the eldest brother's lineage is cut off, someone must be left to take charge of the Xiao family. Even if I tell you, can you take on this important task? The Queen Mother narrowed her eyes slightly. Why can't I? If you could, you wouldn't have foolishly gone to grab Xian and Bakuai back then. The Queen Mother was speechless, snorted lightly and turned her head. Xiao Qi sighed, sat next to her sister, and looked at her cheek carefully. I know that you are like a bird in a cage in the palace, you can see and hear but cannot touch, but you thought you were so comfortable when I was in Huainan, scheming and deceitful all day long, and you didn't even dare to relax even in your sleep. I'm afraid that if I make the slightest mistake, the millennium of the Xiao family's incense will be ruined in my hands. You won't be able to feel the pain. You entered the palace and became a widow, and I still won't marry. I can only say that my two sisters' lives are not good. How can you say that? Did I treat you badly? The Queen Mother pursed her lips, remained silent for a while, and then breathed a sigh of relief. Forget it, it's like this, just live a good life in the future. Xiao Qi nodded and stood up. I'll walk with you. The Queen Mother hesitated, pinched the small wooden sign in her arms, and said softly, Sister, come here, I want to discuss something with you. Xiao Qi smiled a little, sat down next to her again, and asked as she did when she was young. Tell me, what do you want to ask your sister for help? Did you get into trouble or something else? The familiar scene made the Queen Mother's nose sour. She raised her hand to rub it and then whispered, I have been in the palace for 10 years and have never gone out alone. I heard that Qujiang Lake is very beautiful tonight. Can you help me like you did when we were children? Xiao Qi blinked and hesitated. When she was 11 or 12 years old, her sister was more unruly and naughty. She always wanted to run around, but the daughter of a noble family could not show up easily. Because she had gotten into trouble, her family also controlled her sister more strictly. In order to go out, her sister often pretended to be her name and asked her to stay in the boudoir. But that was a child after all, and impersonating the Queen Mother was not a small crime. When the Queen Mother saw Xiao Qi hesitate, her eyes softened immediately, as if begging for Su Buling. Good sister, just once, I have been in the deep palace for 10 years, do you want me to die of old age in the palace? And it doesn't matter if someone finds out, the current emperor won't punish me, I am his mother, at most the royal family will spread some bad things in private, if you don't say it, I won't say it, no one will find out, I will be back in 2 days. Xiao Qi blinked, thought for a while, and smiled, come back tomorrow morning, I still have things to do. I will stay in the capital for a while, and I will let you go out for a walk when you have time. The Queen Mother's eyes suddenly showed some spirit, and she quickly stood up and pulled Xiao Qi to the bedroom. Change your clothes, let's go now, your carriage should be parked outside the palace. Xiao Qi was dragged forward by her sister, and there was some helplessness in her eyes. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 264. In the bedroom of Prince Su's mansion, a lamp was placed on the table. Mrs. Lu was very tired, and her skirt was even wet with sweat. She got down from the soft couch, straightened the thin pants and skirt that were stuck in the seam, and said with a smile, Your Majesty, how are you? Su Buling's face turned blue, he just felt that he could not survive or die, and the dragon-locking goo that was suppressed by him was about to break out. But Mrs. Lu had good intentions when she took massage seriously. She could not blame Mrs. Lu for her evil intentions. Su Buling lay down for a moment to calm down and suppress the unknown fire, then he sat up and said with a smile. Not bad, I'd better let the maid do this kind of thing from now on. Aunt Lu is weak, is she exhausted? Mrs. Lu was indeed a little tired, and her arms were so sore. She put away the medicinal wine, wiped her hands and rubbed her arms, with a sense of accomplishment in her eyes. It's okay. The imperial doctor said that the medicinal wine is very strong and can only be used once every half-month. I will just rest for a few days and be fine. It's really powerful. Su Buring smiled softly, stood up and put on his robe, and helped Mrs. Lu to go out. I'll take you back. You're sweating all over. You have something to do tomorrow, so go to bed early. Mrs. Lu had just been chatting with Su Buling for a long time. She was tired and thirsty now. Seeing that Su Buling was also a little tired, she called Yunu in and said with a smile, you should also go to bed early. I will go back by myself, but I'll come back and take you to Xiao's house tomorrow. Su Buling nodded with a smile and sent Mrs. Lu out of the corridor. His eyes glanced at Feng Fengjian's back with some disobedience, and his reason made him look away. What the hell kind of medicinal wine is this? Su Buling frowned and turned his gaze to Xiao Manzi, who was still sleeping soundly in the garden, and Ning Yuhi, who was meditating. Steamed bun. Su Buring coughed lightly, rubbed his forehead, turned around and walked into the house, changed into a jet black robe, and then flew up to the eaves. Ning Yuhi had not been in trance, thinking about random things. He raised his head when he heard the movement, looked at the apprentice who was walking on the roof, and said doubtfully, Ling what's wrong? Su Buling stood on the roof and blinked. Well, go out and do some errands. After saying that, he disappeared on the eaves. Doing errands late at night. Ning Yuhi frowned, and after a little calculation, it seemed that almost half a month had passed since the last time the Queen Mother went to see Furong. Ning Yuhi's eyes widened with a very strange expression, and he thought to himself, could it be that your daughter is planning to bully the Queen Mother in the palace? How can this be done? Ning Yuhi wanted to get up and follow him to persuade Su Buling not to take the risk, but it seemed wrong to persuade Su Buling. After hesitating for a moment, he just pretended that he hadn't seen anything and hugged Zhu Manzi, who was sleeping soundly. In the house, the palace lantern swayed in the wind. The charming beauty in a long black dress, leading Chiao Yi to look dignified, walked briskly out of the lifeless Chang'e palace. Xiao Qi stood in the corridor and watched. The belt around her waist vividly outlined her gourd-like figure. A golden hairpin was inserted diagonally between Ling Yun's buns. The golden hairpin held a pearl in its head, and her hands were folded on her waist. The dignified and noble character in his heart is revealed without any deliberate movements. After the figure disappeared into the majestic palace city, Xiao Qi raised her hand to hook the hair beside her ears, lowered her head and unfolded her red phoenix robe to take a look, shook her head and smiled helplessly, then turned and walked towards the bedroom. The palace maids who followed looked at the strong woman following the Queen Mother and wondered why the Queen Mother and Miss Xiao had changed the maid. However, as palace maids, they naturally didn't want to say much about these things, so they followed behind honestly. Xiao Qi walked under the eaves of the dormitory, tilted her head slightly, and said in a cold voice, I'm in a bad mood. Please go down and have a rest. You don't need to wait on me anymore. Yes. The maids wanted to get off work a long time ago, so they bowed slightly and ran away chattering. Xiao Qi frowned slightly when she saw this unruly look, but the deep palace was already lifeless. It was wrong to force people into zombies just to enforce the rules. She didn't say much at the moment, but turned her head and looked at the personal maid. Lanhua, you should go and rest too. Nothing will happen in the imperial city. The sturdy Lan Hua nodded slightly and walked towards the house near the dormitory. Xiao Qi entered the dormitory alone. Looking at the dazzling treasure shelves and the neatly arranged tools on the table, she seemed to be able to imagine her sister staying here alone and busy for a long night. She walked slowly to the duobao shelf and looked at the handmade figures, ponies, and cars on it, with a bit of a smile in her eyes. The craftsmanship is really bad. After looking at it for a moment, Xiao Qi found that although there was a dazzling array of things, there was nothing that caught her eye. Xiao Qi was not yet sleepy, so she turned around and walked to the phoenix bed to sit down. Staring at the decorated but lifeless Nyoda bedroom, she didn't know what to do for a while. I used to be the head of the Xiao family in Huainan. I never relaxed for a quarter of an hour in many years. I was also driven almost crazy by the mountain of pressure. Over time, I got used to it. Suddenly arriving in this idle palace, after the initial sense of novelty dissipated, the whole world seemed to be filled with only dead silence. Only at this moment did Xiao Qi realize with empathy what kind of life her sister, who was born to the same mother, had been living in the past 10 years. If she really entered the palace, she would probably go crazy in 2 or 3 days. Apart from looking forward to reaching the end of her life soon, there seemed to be nothing she could look forward to. Xiao Qi pursed her lips, her blood was connected. How could she not feel sorry for her biological sister, but her life was at the other extreme, not much better than her sister who suffered in the palace. Such is the way of the world. Among the rivalries between noble families, emperors, and generals, a person's life and death are insignificant, not to mention a little loneliness or pressure. Xiao Qi sat by the bed for a while, not feeling sleepy at all. Maybe she wanted to experience her sister's daily life firsthand, so she stood up and walked around, looking along the objects on the shelf, and found a few from the corner of the dormitory. Wine bottle. He knelt down and picked up a small silver pot, opened it, put it to his nose and smelled it, and a very special fragrance hit his nostrils. Well. Xiao Qi's face was calm, but her heart was twitching. After thinking about it, she stood up and walked to the back window, poured the poisonous wine in the jug directly into the garden, threw the bottle away, and then walked back to the shelf. Examine the remaining flagons. Fortunately, there was only one pot of poisonous wine, and the rest were the drinks from the Xinghua Brewing, Qingyu Brewing and Duanyu Shao. Xiao Qi often hears about this, the best liquor in the world, from her customers. She just doesn't drink at all in order to keep her mind clear on weekdays, but tonight, it seems that she can temporarily forget about those machinations. The silence at night is a bit scary, so quiet that you can't even feel the sound if you carefully feel it, as if the whole world is dead. Xiao Qi was silent for a moment, picked up a pot of broken jade roast, walked to the bedside, squatted down and touched under the bed with her hands, and easily found the small box that the Queen Mother had tried to hide. After so many years, I haven't changed my habit of hiding things. Xiao Qi picked up the small box, walked to the soft couch and sat down. First she picked up the Duanyu Shao and took a sip. When the sake enters the throat, the heat rushes straight into the heart, like red-hot molten iron stirring in the stomach, making people tremble uncontrollably. But it is this unbearable strong drink that makes people put aside all their thoughts and concentrate on the drink. A layer of sweat appeared on Xiao Qi's forehead. She frowned and coughed twice. She finally understood why people in the world regarded this drink, which had no other characteristics besides being strong, as a fine wine that they should have a sip before they die. The road to the world is long, and most of it is accompanied by loneliness. Only this kind of thing that is difficult to swallow can make people feel that they are still alive and not a walking corpse. Call. Xiao Qi paused for a moment, then picked up the wine bottle and looked at it. No wonder people in the world say that after one sip, you will never forget it. It's true. After taking another sip of Duanyu Shao, Xiao Qi put down the wine bottle, opened the box and took a look at it. Rice paper, purse, Little man, foxtail. The little figure carved out of wood was a young man who raised his hands and bowed. He looked very beautiful, and she couldn't recognize who it was. After Xiaoqi looked at it for a few times, she put the wooden figure aside and picked up the foxtail, a white and fluffy tail, with a cone carved from mahogany at the top, a bit like a plug. It must not have been finished yet, as it was not polished fine enough. Xiaoqi thought for a long time with the foxtail, but couldn't figure out its use. She just thought it was part of a large object and put it back in the box. Then she picked up the purse next to it. After opening it, she poured out a red string wearing golden quail eggs. Xiaoqi's blushing cheeks showed a bit of confusion. She took the golden quail egg and looked at it carefully. Then she held it to her ear and shook it. There was a slight sound of something turning inside. After pondering for a moment, she pinched the red rope with her hand and pulled it. Rustle. Buzz buzz. The golden quail eggs shake, which is quite magical. There was a bit of confusion on Xiaoqi's cheeks. She squinted her eyes and thought for a moment, then threw the golden quail eggs on the couch with a dash, with a bit of annoyance in her eyes. After thinking about it, she took it out as if avoiding a snake or scorpion. He took out his handkerchief, put the golden quail eggs back into his purse, and threw them into the box. This Yang is all a mess. Xiaoqi's eyes were strange, her brows furrowed slightly. She was silent for a moment, then sighed again, raised her hand to pick up a stack of rice paper, opened it and glanced at it, but she was stunned after this glance. When autumn comes on the 8th day of the 9th month, when my flowers have bloomed, hundreds of flowers will be killed. Chang'an will be filled with incense, and the city will be filled with golden armor. Who wrote this anti-poem? Glow in the dark cup of fine grape wine. If you want to drink pipa, please hurry up. The east wind blows thousands of trees and flowers into bloom at night. It also blows down stars like rain. Xiaoqi's eyes gradually became serious, and she carefully looked at the poem manuscript in her hand. She never expected that her sister had hidden so many poems that were rare in the world. She knows that Xiang likes poetry and talents, but she likes them anyway. Where did she get these poems that have never been spread out? There is no such talent in her memory. After casually browsing, Xiaoqi's eyes became more and more surprised. It was obvious that these poems were not written by one person, but each of them was a masterpiece that could only be seen in a century. The person who wrote these poems was not like this world at all. People. It's quiet at night and the lights are quiet. Xiaoqi, who was wearing a bright red phoenix skirt, gradually leaned on the soft couch. She held a wine bottle in one hand and put the poem manuscript on her lap. She read it carefully one by one. The only sound left in the room was the rustling of papers. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 265. The palace lanterns swayed in the majestic and heavy imperial city, and there was no sound at all. Su Buling, dressed in a black robe with gold edges and elegant appearance, entered Changle Palace with ease, walked back and forth in the intricate palace city, and gradually arrived at the Queen Mother's bedroom. Su Buling was massaged by Aunt Lu for an entire afternoon today, but he still didn't feel the benefits. The dragon-locking poison was almost poisoned. Otherwise, he wouldn't have come to bother the Queen Mother in the middle of the night. Stopping outside the bedroom, Su Buling's ears moved slightly, and he noticed a long breath in the distance, which sounded like a master. He walked nearby and took a look. It was a tall maid, and he didn't know where she came from. Su Buling frowned. There were many secret guards in the imperial city, and he couldn't know them all. He didn't make a noise at the moment, and walked silently to the outside of the Queen Mother's bedroom and easily climbed in through the window. The lights were on in the room. The Queen Mother, wearing a fiery red palace skirt, was lying on the couch. There were a few manuscripts of poems on the carpet next to the couch. There was a wine pot on the table, and the cool wine dripped onto the coffee table. "Why did you drink so much?" Su Buling frowned slightly, walked over and squatted, and took a glance. The Queen Mother's baby cheeks were slightly red, her eyes were closed, her breathing was slightly unstable, and she put her hand on her lower abdomen, revealing a piece of red rope. Su Buling shook his head and laughed a little. He raised his hand and gently opened his fingers, took out the golden quail egg, pulled it twice, and then put it on the Queen Mother's baby's legs. "Woo!" The Queen Mother frowned slightly, pushed it gently with her hand, bit her lower lip, and her expression was particularly seductive. Su Buling smiled softly, approached her, raised his hand and patted her cheek twice. "Baby, baby." "Woo." The Queen Mother slightly opened her eyes were blurred, and after a dazed glance, she was at a loss for a long time before she murmured. You are a fairy." Su Buling blinked his eyes and raised his hand to touch his face. To be honest, he did look a bit fairy-like, but it was the first time that he was praised by the Queen Mother baby. "Drank too much, do you want to detoxify?" "Woo, detoxify, what?" The Queen Mother was obviously drunk, frowned and turned over slightly, her hands swaying, as if she wanted to take something on the table. Su Buling glanced and found the detoxification tale that he talked about with the Queen Mother baby last time in the box. Unexpectedly, the Queen Mother baby really did it stupidly. He picked it up and looked at it. It was a little rough and had not been polished yet, so he put it down, picked up the little wooden man on the table, and put it in the Queen Mother's hand. "Here, what's the matter?" "Fairies, this thing is mentioned in the book, it really exists." The Queen Mother muttered something vaguely, brought the wooden man closer to her and looked at it, then looked at Su Buling, as if comparing them. Su Buling naturally didn't understand the drunk talk. After thinking for a while, he moved closer, stood up and lay on the couch, raised his hand to hug the dizzy Queen Mother, used his arm as a pillow for her to lean on, and leaned closer to kiss her forehead. "Baby, call me Brother Ling." "Woo." The Queen Mother seemed to be a little sober, but immediately became confused. She half closed her eyes and tilted her head, as if trying to distinguish whether she was dreaming or something else. Her voice was unclear. "The palace, how could there be a fairy, it's so hot, Orchid?" Su Buling was a little helpless. He didn't expect the Queen Mother to drink more than last time, and even her words were confused. At that moment, he could only hug her tightly and gently. "Woo." The Queen Mother hummed softly, her body trembled slightly, her eyes opened a little, and she seemed to want to raise her hand, but she lost her strength after just moving it. The four lips were together, warm and moist like honey. The Queen Mother's forehead and body were sweating. She had no strength to resist. After a while, she just had instinct and rubbed against Su Buling. Su Buling's eyebrows were curved with a smile. They were already an old couple, and he knew what the Queen Mother liked very well. He raised his hand to extinguish the candle on the table. Swish! The red phoenix skirt fell apart, revealing the golden lotus hiding the carp. The breeze was faint and the night was long. The Changal Palace, which had been lifeless for 10 years, seemed to have something different tonight. Thousands of streets and hundreds of alleys, the lights were as bright as day. The Xiao family's carriage slowly passed through the wide streets and entered the bustling market where people came and went. Xiao Xiang wearing a black long skirt and a veil on her head, asked her attendants to stop the carriage, and jumped off with Jiao Yi. Like a little girl going out for shopping for the first time, she ran directly towards the crowd. If she hadn't restrained herself, she would definitely turn around a few times in the street lights and breathe the smell of freedom. Miss, slow down." Jiao Yi trotted behind her. Hua Jingting, holding a folding fan, followed quickly behind and advised. "Second miss, your status as the eldest lady is here, you should be more stable, it's not good to spread it out." Xiao Xiang'er trotted a few steps with her skirt lifted. For the first time, she looked at the surrounding streets and people coming and going freely. Even if it was just for this moment, she felt that the past 10 years were not a life for a human being. As the Queen Mother, she was just a bird in a cage. Qiao Yi could sense the excitement of the young lady, so she ran up to her, took her arm, and whispered, "Hurry up, you finally got a moment out, don't waste it, where do you want to go? Where do you want to go?" Hearing this question, Xiao Xiang'er was suddenly stunned. Yes, where to go? I had thought about life outside the palace walls for countless days and nights, tea stalls, wine shops, opera troupes, Longjian Pavilion, Zhuangyuan Street, and mountains, rivers, lakes and seas outside Chang'an. I had thought about going there countless times. But when I was free again, standing outside the palace walls I had dreamed of, there was only one person and a string of candied haws in my mind. If it wasn't for a moment, if I had been outside all the time. Xiao Xiang'er froze in place, looking at the familiar yet unfamiliar streets in front of her. After putting aside her identity as the Queen Mother, she suddenly realized that her world seemed to have only Su Buling left. National justice, seniority, etiquette, and rules, all had nothing to do with her. If I were free, I wouldn't have to hide it like this. I could openly let that boy propose marriage, openly walk on the ferry bridge, openly let him take me to the places I want to go most in the world. Unfortunately, all this will only last for one night. Xiao Xiang'er stood there, looking at the real but extremely illusory prosperity of the world in front of her, and suddenly she regretted coming out. You shouldn't experience what you can't get. But, it's already out. Miss, where do you want to go? A call sounded from my ear. Xiao Xiang'er came back to her senses, lowered her head and touched her waist, took out the small mahogany plaque that she had carried with her since she carved the first stroke, and stroked the handwriting on it. In one's lifetime, one must be himself at least once. Since my sister has given me this opportunity, I must cherish it, even if it's only for one day or one night. Thinking of this, Xiao Xiang'er turned around and said softly, "Uncle Hua, can you go to the Suwang mansion and call the Suwang prince over? I know him very well and want him to take me for a walk." Hua Jingting walked up to her, looked at the somewhat distracted young lady, and sighed softly. "Miss, Su Buling's identity is extraordinary, and he is in trouble recently. Tomorrow, the eldest young lady will meet him, you'd better not contact him easily, it's related to the rise and fall of the Xiao family." Xiao Xiang'er's face darkened, tightly grasping the small mahogany card in her hand, she was silent for a moment, and smiled faintly. "Is that so? After all, everything is fake." After saying that, Xiao Xiang'er looked at the lights on the street. For some reason, the most beautiful things in the world just now turned gray again. "If you want to give me a reward, you can give it to the character Aunt Lu. I'm just a little bit away from my birthday." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 266. The long night was silent, and it was already early morning. It was dawn, and the raindrops hit the window. The empty dormitory was very quiet, and there was still a faint smell of alcohol. Xiao Qi lay on the pillow facing inward, slowly opened her almond eyes, and then her face was slightly stiff, staring at the curtain that was close at hand. Last night she remembered reading poetry alone on the couch, lonely in the deep palace, and drinking some strong wine, and then her memory began to blur. It seemed that in a dream, she saw the elegant young man carved by Xiang'er, turned into a real person, squatting in front of her, talking with a friendly smile, without any malice, as if he was a very close relative. She had been well read since she was a child, and the Xiao family also hid a lot of strange stories, such as monsters turning into human forms to repay favors, etc., which she just used as idle things to relieve boredom when she was young. She didn't expect to really see it. It must be a dream. The male demon looked like a disaster to the country and the people, exactly like the description in the strange stories. He lay with her, hugged her, and kissed her. She was born in a family of aristocrats since she was a child. The etiquette was very strict, and she also paid attention to these things. She must have never experienced the affairs of men and women. At most, she had read some lifeless introductions in books. But it is undeniable that people have nature. Reason can restrain, but it is difficult to control in sleep. In the long night, it is not that she has not had some strange dreams, but it's just that this time it is so real, different from every dream before. She can feel every bit, even the smell of breathing can make her tremble all over, unable to control herself. Could it be a fairy? How could there be a fairy in the palace, such a beautiful fairy? Just when she was dizzy last night and only had this little bit of thinking left, suddenly a certain part hurt. She woke up a little at that time, and the fairy also said huh, and said baby, what's wrong? She didn't know what happened, she only persisted for a moment, and her consciousness was completely scattered, sinking into the sea of desire. Vaguely, it seems that at the end, she obeyed the orders of the devil and did many things that are unimaginable at ordinary times. It must be a fairy, it must be a dream. But the moment Xiao Qi woke up in the morning, she knew that she was not dreaming. Everything that happened last night was real. Someone had taken her, no, someone had taken the Queen Mother. Xiao Qi was extremely thoughtful. She could tell the whole story from a single glimpse. Thinking of the poems, villains, and quail eggs from last night, she guessed roughly that the Queen Mother's sister, who was conservative and miserable in the palace, happened to meet a young man with unparalleled literary talent and handsome appearance. Under the other party's eloquence, she finally couldn't bear the loneliness and crossed the line that she should never have crossed, and kept a lover. But there were no other men in the imperial city. The man looked very young and handsome. He was definitely not a secret guard, and certainly not a eunuch. If he could appear in the imperial city at night, he must be a palace maid in disguise, or he must be very skilled in martial arts. It was more likely that a man would stay with Xiang'er in disguise as a palace maid. After all, the man disguised as a palace maid must be a beauty. It was true that Xiao Qi felt angry and humiliated when she found out about this situation and was dragged into losing her virginity. However, after 10 years in the Xiao family, she had already learned to put aside useless emotions and only think about what to do and how to solve the problem. She had already lost her virginity, but she could not commit suicide for the sake of her reputation, because if she lost the Huainan Xiao family, she might be gone. She had to live even if she had to grit her teeth and endure the humiliation and suffering. Xiang'er's keeping a lover is against etiquette and rules, but after just staying in the palace for a while yesterday, she understood how her sister suffered from loneliness day and night. Xiang'er is not her. She has been willful and capricious since childhood. It is normal for her to be deceived by sweet words and can't stand loneliness. She should not be blamed. This matter cannot be spread out, otherwise Xiang'er will be finished. She will definitely be given a cup of poisoned wine. Then the only solution to this matter that cannot be seen by others is to kill the lover and warn Xiang'er to prevent her from making the same mistake again. Thinking of this, Xiao Qi took a breath, raised her smooth wrist, and wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes. After all, she is a girl. No matter how tough and iron-handed she is, how can she not have some psychological waves when encountering such a thing? Xiao Qi forced herself to suppress all her thoughts, gritted her teeth and endured the unspeakable pain in her body. She turned over and wanted to get up to finish the matter, but Xiao Qi turned around with some difficulty and saw a man in a black robe sitting on the bed, with his back to her, holding his cheeks with both hands, his elbows on his knees, looking exhausted. It shouldn't be, it's hard to explain, it's a bit like thinking too long and causing a headache. Woo. Xiaoqi was obviously frightened and trembled. She hurriedly pulled up the quilt to cover her body. Her eyes were wide open, but her mind was turning rapidly. Why didn't this dead lover leave? Lanhua is outside, calling for someone to arrest her will definitely spread the news. Judging from her figure, she can't beat him. What should I do? Soon, the man breathed a sigh of relief, straightened up and turned his head, revealing a gorgeous face with a bright smile. Baby, are you awake? That's how he called Xiang'er last night, and he didn't realize that someone else had changed. No, there was blood. Xiaoqi glanced at the quilt calmly. Because of the dim light in the early morning, a little blood stain was barely noticeable, and it was exposed from the edge of the quilt. Xiaoqi's face remained unchanged. She suppressed her mind and gently covered the blood stain with her legs. She looked up at the man, revealing a bit of superiority. Are you still not leaving? There was no need to be polite to a mistress who coveted beauty and power. The man smiled, looked at her carefully, and then came over and kissed her on the forehead. Xiaoqi's expression was always tepid. After years of high-intensity training, her heartbeat had never accelerated. After the man kissed her forehead, she said with a little dissatisfaction. It's dawn, let's go. Okay. The man stood up and walked to the window. He flashed and prepared to jump out of the window, but it seemed that he couldn't control his strength. He used too much force and his forehead hit the wall on the window directly. In mid-air, he reacted very quickly and raised his hand to support the wall. He fell lightly, without making any sound from beginning to end, and then jumped out of the window. Although Xiaoqi doesn't know martial arts, her eyesight is not bad. Her smooth reaction and movements just now are probably no worse than those of the family's retainers. She came in from outside the palace. Who is this person? There seems to be no such person in the world. Xiaoqi hugged herself with the quilt and sat for a while. Although she tried her best to suppress her mind and think about what she should think about, she couldn't suppress the tears in the corners of her eyes. Finally, she buried her face in the quilt and forced herself to hold back her tears. The sound of crying was almost inaudible. After a long time, the sky was bright, and the sound of palace maids walking outside came. Xiaoqi raised her face, her eyes were red, but she had recovered her usual appearance. She gritted her teeth and got down to the ground. She slowly put on the Queen Mother's phoenix skirt, and cut off the blood stain on the quilt with scissors. She wanted to burn it directly with a fire stick, but after a little hesitation, she put it in her arms. Dong! Dong! The morning bell rang through Chang'an, and the heavy rain pattered between the pavilions and towers of the majestic imperial city. The palace gates opened one by one, and the civil and military officials slowly entered the Taiji Hall from under the eaves of the palace. Su Buling, wearing a black and gold-edged young man's robe, stood under the eaves of a high tower on the side of Zuk Street, overlooking the imperial city in the distance, and his face was still difficult to calm down. What the hell? After thinking for a long time, Su Buling could only utter the sentence lightly. Last night, he went to the Deep Palace at night, naturally to find the Queen Mother to detoxify. The Queen Mother was drunk at the time. Although her expression was slightly different from usual, her body's reaction was normal. Later, she was quite involved. Although she was drunk and could not move on her own, she would still do whatever she was asked to do. If it was just like this, Su Buling would not find any problems. At most, he would think that the Queen Mother's reaction was a little different. After drinking so much and getting drunk, it was not strange to be a little abnormal. But after Su Buling detoxified according to the habit of the two of them in the past, he discovered a very terrifying fact: the detoxification effect was outstanding. The cold poison of the dragon locking goo disappeared by 90%. If you don't feel it carefully, You can't find the remaining cold poison in your body. Your body is even stronger than when you were 16 years old. At that moment, Su Buling knew that something was wrong. The woman in his arms who looked exactly like the Queen Mother was definitely not the Queen Mother. At that time, Su Buling hurriedly got up and looked carefully, and found a few blood stains, which confirmed his guess. He checked the woman's face again. There was no skin on her face. The woman in front of him could only be the Empress Dowager's sister Xiao Qi, the eldest daughter of the Xiao family and the head of the family. She was praised as a wonderful woman who, if she were a man, she would be a national hero. She would be his future sister-in-law. Su Buling's scalp was numb just thinking about it. He squatted on the roof, pinching his chin and thinking hard about the whole thing. How could Miss Xiao be in the palace? Wasn't she in the Xiao family? Even if she was in the palace, why was she wearing the Empress Dowager's clothes and even dressed up exactly like the Empress Dowager? The crime of pretending to be the Empress Dowager is not small. Who would have thought that this Empress Dowager was a fake and drunk? Where did the Empress Dowager baby go? Su Buling pondered for a moment. The matter was done and there was nothing he could do. When he found out that there was a problem, he certainly couldn't continue to detoxify, and he couldn't just leave. If Xiao Qi couldn't bear it when she woke up and committed suicide, he would have to blame himself for the rest of his life, and the Queen Mother would hate him to death. Helplessly, he could only sit by her side, waiting for Xiao Qi to wake up, and try every means to comfort her, otherwise this disaster would be a big deal. Fortunately, Xiao Qi was a talented woman with a strong mind. After waking up and finding that he hadn't left, she didn't make a fuss, but continued to pretend to be the Queen Mother. Seeing this scene, he naturally felt relieved. He observed outside the room for a while, and only ran out of the palace after making sure that Xiao Qi would not commit suicide. In the misty rain all over the city, Su Buling stood on the top of the tower, sighed softly, and focused on his body. Xiao Qi must have been the one who raised the poison in the Xiao family back then, otherwise there wouldn't be such an immediate effect. Originally, he had to come with the Queen Mother for dozens of times, but now he had almost detoxified her, so he naturally had more confidence in dealing with the variables later. However, this news must not be known by the people behind the scenes, otherwise it would be unimaginable what would greet him. The secret guards would come out in full force to assassinate him, lock his collarbone, or directly find another dragon-locking goo to attack him. Su Buling thought of this and felt his pulse. He could still sense the presence of the dragon-locking goo. As for how much he had recovered, as long as he pretended to be weak and didn't use his full strength, no one should be able to tell. After a brief thought, Su Buling jumped down from the top of the tower, and turned into a black afterimage in the rain, floating silently through the streets of Chang'an City and heading to the palace on Kuishao Street. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 267. During the drizzle, Xiao Mansion's carriage stopped outside the imperial city. The maids of Chang'an Palace stood at the palace gate, waiting quietly with the chariot beside them. Xiao Xiang'er, who was wearing a long black dress, was helped out of the carriage by Qiao Yi. She was holding a Xiao parcel in her hand, which was full of trivial items bought from the market and Qujiang Pond last night. Although the failure to call Su Buling made this trip out of the palace a lot of fun, it was much more interesting than the boring deep palace. Xiao Xiang'er still had a lot of fun. He didn't sleep a wink all night, lying on the bed with Qiao Yi. On the big lawn by the river pool, I watched the stars and fed the mosquitoes, set off fireworks and ate a lot of candied haws, just like at home in Huainan. I knew it was raining lightly in the early morning, so I reluctantly got on the carriage. In the blink of an eye, it was already bright, and Xiao Xiang'er returned to the outside of Chang'an Palace as a guest for the first time. He sat on the soft couch and looked back at Chang'an in the rain. Maybe this is the only chance in my life. If my sister had not left, she might be able to come out a few more times. Next time I must call Su Buling. Thinking of this, Xiao Xianger frowned slightly, put away his mind, and allowed himself to return to the Queen Mother who shouldered the family's honor and etiquette rules. She sat on the chariot dignifiedly and politely and entered the palace. Chiao Yi was a little unhappy, so she covered her mouth with her hands and hid him, then she came close to the chariot and whispered. Miss, the Queen Mother must not have slept well last night. The palace is very lifeless. It's scary when it rains and winds. Xiao Xianger snorted lightly, maintaining the posture of the head of the Xiao family, sitting on the chariot neatly. She is so courageous that even the devil is afraid of her. If she has nothing to do, she will definitely turn things into a mess. After saying this, Xiao Xianger suddenly frowned. She wouldn't have dug out my little box, would she? The quail eggs and the little man are still inside. Thinking of this, Xiao Xianger's eyes panicked slightly. He urged the chariot to run quickly to the back of the dormitory, then got down and ran outside the dormitory on foot. In the early morning, the palace maids were preparing breakfast. 5 big and 3 thick orchids were standing under the eaves, being scolded by Xiao Qi with a cold face. Did you fall asleep last night? Lan Hua was more honest, and just lowered her head. No, what happened last night? Xiao Qi frowned, hesitated for a moment, and said coldly, there were birds flying around outside the window last night, and you didn't notice it? Lan Hua's face was blank, she had indeed discovered nothing. When Xiao Xianger saw this scene, she thought that this intelligent sister was frightened by the cold environment in the palace, so she stepped forward and said with a smile. Queen Mother, it's just a few birds, it's no big deal. No big deal. There was a hint of shame, anger, and humiliation in Xiao Qi's eyes, but there were some words she obviously couldn't say. She tightened her tight phoenix skirt, turned around and walked into the dormitory. You come in with me, and the others go down. Yes. The maid and palace maid remained silent and quickly retreated. Xiao Xianger blinked, a little confused, followed into the bedroom, turned around and closed the door. Sister, what's wrong? Xiao Qi clutched the hem of her skirt tightly and walked back and forth in the room. Her expression was as calm as ever, but her eyes were a little confused. After walking a few steps, he sat down on the soft couch and said coldly. Xiao Xianger, you always tell me, what have you done in the palace these years? Xiao Xianger was a little confused, walked to the side and sat down, looking at her somewhat angry sister. I've been here for 10 years and even getting sick is a luxury. What can I do? Xiao Qi pursed her lips. Seeing that Xiao Xianger was still pretending to be innocent, she felt a little angry in her heart, but she also knew that her sister had not had an easy life these years. The man last night was unparalleledly handsome, and those poems must have been sent by that man. With his eloquent tongue, it was normal for my sister not to be able to withstand the temptation. If it were pointed out directly, with Xianger's temperament, he would have no shame to commit suicide in front of others. No, this matter can only be handled by her as a sister. Thinking of this, Xiao Qi's anger subsided a bit. She sat up straight and looked at her sisters seriously. Xianer, I know how miserable you are, but no matter how hard, tired or wronged you are, you must remember that your surname is Xiao. The children of the Xiao family, are by no means those barbarians and foolish women in the market. We regard the world as our own responsibility. Honor and disgrace, reputation, and even life and death can be thrown away. You have to remember your identity. Xiao Xianger nodded lightly. She always remembered that in order to prevent chaos in the world, she sacrificed her life to save Su Buling. Consciously having a clear conscience, one is naturally confident. You don't need to teach me these things. I remember them better than you. Xiao Qi frowned slightly, wanting to take out the things under the bed and slap her sister directly on the face. But that's not how things work after all. She thought for a moment and said in a deep voice. I am the elder sister. I am in charge of the Xiao family in Huainan. Even if you are married, I can still control you. If I find that you did something wrong that day and correct it a little, you can't blame me as my elder sister." Xiao Xiang'er nodded, a little bored. "You have taken care of me since you were a child. This is not the first time. As long as you are right, when have I ever blamed you?" Xiao Qi nodded, and she didn't say much. After leaving the palace and imprisoning the harmful face Xiao, Xiang'er would naturally understand what she said today when she found out that the face Xiao was missing. It's just a face. She knows her sister's temperament. She is not a foolish woman in the market. After realizing her mistake, she will naturally forget it. When the time comes, she will bury the man and the matter will be over. Thinking of this, Xiao Qi stood up, took off her red phoenix robe, threw it aside, and stretched out her hand. "Give me my clothes." Xiao Xiang'er was actually a little reluctant to part with it, and thought for a while, "There is a family dinner at my house today, and I haven't been back for a long time. Otherwise." Xiao Qi's eyes darkened slightly. "Prince Su is here for the banquet today. It's very important. What's the use of you going? Just stay in the palace, I'll come back in a few days." When Xiao Xiang'er heard this, she felt guilty and couldn't say much. While taking off her robe, she looked at the bed inside, feeling a little confused. "Why did you change all the bedding and pillows?" The expression in Xiao Qi's eyes changed slightly. She folded her arms and looked away. "I drank too much last night. I vomited on the bed and threw it all away." Xiao Xiang'er's eyes were full of disgust. After thinking about it for a while, his face became nervous again. "What did you drink?" "I've thrown away the poisoned wine. If you feel really depressed in the future, just send me a letter and I'll come over to stay with you for a few days. Don't always think about seeking death." Xiao Qi said this and sighed softly. She was a little hesitant about how to deal with that face Xiao. Maybe it would be better to be castrated and sent to the palace as a eunuch. Although he couldn't do anything to satisfy his sister, the dead face Xiao could not do anything to satisfy his sister. Her verbal skills are very good, and she should be able to relieve her sister's loneliness. In the deep palace, food fights are very common, and it is not uncommon for concubines who have fallen out of favor to mix with eunuchs. Xiang'er is the queen mother, and even if the current emperor knows, the other party is the eunuch is not considered a man, so he won't be too angry after thinking about it. It's better than my sister being suffocated to death. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 268. In the afternoon, the streets of Kuaishao Street were shrouded in misty rain. Su Buling wore a snow-white cloud-patterned prince's robe, a jade hairpin on his head and a jade pendant hanging from his waist. Yishu Linfen, who was dressed by Mrs. Liu, was walking on the roadside holding an oil paper umbrella. Mrs. Liu was also dressed up, hiding under Su Buling's oil paper umbrella, her shoulders pressed against her arms, and she kept talking. "Miss Xiao is very powerful." At that time, the old family leader Xiao was respected as the unparalleled scholar of the country. Together with your grandfather, General Su, they were the two pillars of the Daio court. Miss Xiao has had the demeanor of her grandfather since she was a child. Conduct oneself in society, and follow the rules in every word and deed. When you meet her later, be sure to pay attention to your speech and behavior, and don't be underestimated by her. Su Buling's face was a little stiff. He held Mrs. Liu's arm and was thinking about how to say hello when they met later. But no matter how he thought about it, it would be a chilling scene later. As the saying goes, to extend one's head is a sword, and to shrink one's head is also a sword. No matter how powerful Miss Xiao was, there was nothing she could do against him, the prince of the feudal lord. Su Buling hesitated for a moment, but he could only put on a cold and extraordinary look, and said with a chuckle, "Don't worry, Aunt Liu. Miss Xiao will be more polite when she sees me. Well, Mrs. Lu pursed her lips and smiled, tilting her head to look at her carefully dressed baby. That's natural. Miss Xiao is not married yet. When she sees you, the most beautiful man in Dayo, she will be stunned for a moment. Humph, no matter how powerful she is still a young lady who has not yet left the court. When Su Buling heard this, his heart suddenly moved, and he thought for a moment, the Su family of King Su, and the Xiao family of Weinan, they are well matched. I haven't chosen the crown prince yet. Spit. Mrs. Lu was immediately annoyed and her eyes were a little annoyed. She raised her hand and pinched Su Buling's waist. What are you thinking about? Miss Xiao is several years older than you, how can she be the crown prince's concubine? I call her aunt, and now that she is the crown prince's concubine, is it possible for me to call you uncle? I am your aunt. Your mother and I are righteous Jijinlan sisters. Just a word of twisting, only to make Su Buling look like he was begging for mercy. Aunt Lu, I was just joking. Humph. Mrs. Lu naturally knew that Su Buling was joking, so she folded her hands on her waist again and thought about it carefully. But you are right. The crown princess is not just a wife. She must be married to Dayo's family. It stands to reason that you should marry the princess, but there is no suitable legitimate daughter in the emperor today. Xiao Lukui, the legitimate daughters of Wang Li's family, are either of the wrong age or their status is not suitable, so the crown prince has not been decided yet. Speaking of which, the most suitable one is Miss Xiao, but don't think about this. If you dare to propose marriage to the Xiao family, I. Mrs. Lu was really a little panicked when she said this. Prince Su proposed marriage to the Xiao family, but the Xiao family was not sure whether he would really agree to it. The treasure I had raised for so long was suddenly snatched away by my husband's family, and I had to call her my niece. What a mess. Su Buling smiled, raised his hand to hold Mrs. Lu's shoulders, and said softly. Stop talking about this, the Xiao family is here, let's go in first. Mrs. Lu pursed her lips, her eyes looked a little unhappy for no reason, she gave a faint hum, and walked into the Xiao family's house after being greeted by the steward. In the Xiao family's back house, several maids were waiting outside the courtyard. Listening to the sound of water splashing from the side room with the doors and windows closed, they all looked at each other in confusion, but did not dare to say anything. In the mist-filled wing room, the eldest lady Xiao Qi soaked in the tub, gritted her teeth and washed every part of her body with her hands. After returning to Xiao's house in the morning, she came to the wing room without even drinking a sip of water. I had taken a dozen showers, even my skin was red, and I still felt like there was something strange on my body. Thinking of that shameless and damned man who kissed her everywhere from head to toe, Xiao Qi's face turned red and white. She tried hard to suppress her thoughts and put all her thoughts on cleaning. Miss, the time is almost up. I don't know how long it took, but the maid's call came from outside the door. Xiao Qi sat in the bathtub and took a breath. After all, business matters were more important. She secretly thought that after finishing the work today, she would draw a portrait of that faceless person and send out followers to patrol secretly. She would have to search all over Chang'an. Find people, castrate them and send them to the palace. Don't you like kissing? I'll let you kiss me forever, return the baby, bah. Xiao Qi couldn't calm down. After putting on a long black dress, she put on plain makeup and stood in front of the bronze mirror for a long time. Then she regained her usual imposing aura, walked out of the back house slowly, and headed towards the main hall. The uncles of the Xiao family had already gone to the main hall. The rain was falling, and there was no one in the huge mansion. Only the maids and servants were walking back and forth cautiously. Even though Xiao Qi had just lost her virginity yesterday, her strong mind still allowed her to suppress the strangeness in her thoughts and body, and return her mind to the chess game that affected the entire world. She has already seen that Crown Prince Su is a key son, and all plans and deductions are centered around this powerful and proficient son of the feudal lord. It is rumored in the market that Crown Prince Su has a violent and reckless personality. From his childhood behavior, judging from matters such as Taiji Hall and Bama Village, he is indeed a relatively reckless and rough man, and he is relatively loyal and upright. But the few poems that popped up made her feel that Su Buling was not just as simple as the rumors said. Thinking of the poem, Xiao Qi suddenly felt something was wrong. Before she could think about it carefully, a voice came from in front of her. Ling how was the effect of yesterday's massage? Is your body feeling better? Much better. The man's voice was clear and full of magnetism, very pleasant to the ear. Xiao Qi frowned, thinking that the voice sounded familiar, but she just couldn't remember it vaguely. Knowing that Prince Su was in front, she didn't delay, calmly concentrated and quickly turned the corner of the corridor. Just as she was about to bow and say hello, she saw two figures coming towards her. The one walking in front was her niece-in-law, Mrs. Lu, who was upright and smiling. The one behind was tall and well-proportioned, wearing a snow-white robe, peach blossom eyes, sword-like eyebrows, and a face that was peerless, but also heroic and manly. Baby. Be good, hold it yourself. Xiao Qi's body suddenly froze. The first time she saw that man, her mind flashed back to the drunken night last night when that man looked down at her with the same smile, accompanied by a feeling that was difficult to describe but could never be forgotten. She wanted to live but couldn't, and couldn't die. She even forgot her last name, and just wanted to beg that evil man not to play tricks on her, and that she would listen to him in everything. Xiao Qi's almond eyes widened, her brain that was the best in the world and her mind that was as still as a mountain were gone. She just stared at that face, those peach blossom eyes that she had only seen once, but could never forget in her life. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 269. Under the curtain of rain covering the world, two groups of people stood face to face in the huge mansion. Standing under the eaves of the corridor, the whole world seemed to freeze at this moment. In other words, Miss Xiao's world was frozen at this moment. When Mrs. Lu saw Xiao Qi appearing in front, she leaned over slightly and saluted, Miss. Then she straightened up and waited for the other party to return the salute. For the first time since she was born, Miss Xiao showed a dull expression in front of outsiders and stood there blankly. Mrs. Lu was a little confused, and when she looked back, she found her nephew who was gentle and elegant, and there was no difference at all. She suddenly understood in her heart, and her eyes showed a bit of pride, this city is the only one who has returned to the country. I saw that your daughter was like a nymphomaniac, even worse than a maid. It may not make my scalp numb, but there is nothing I can do about it. I smiled and nodded gently. Miss Xiao. In terms of status, Su Buling, as the eldest son of the vassal prince, is obviously much taller than Xiao Qi, who is just the legitimate daughter of the Xiao family. Unlike the queen mother, it is Xiao Qi who should salute. It's a pity that Xiao Qi, not to mention saluting, didn't scream and call someone to chop this evil man to death. It was a good thing. She stood there blankly until the maid next to her gently pulled down her sleeves and she came to her senses. You. Xiao Qi blurted out in disbelief, then shut up very quickly, turned around and ran back. Just as she turned around, she reacted again, hurriedly calmed her mind and acted calmly, and turned back and bowed ying. See Prince Su, I have been a little uneasy recently due to the heavy travel and traveling. Please atone for your sins. At this moment, besides pretending to be stupid and pretending that she was not in the palace last night, what else could Xiao Qi do? You can't castrate or kill King Su's legitimate son. In that case, you don't have to deduce the situation. You can just wait for King Su to lead his cavalry to bloodbath Huainan. But Xiao Qi's heart was filled with turmoil and a bit of unspeakable humiliation. How could Xiang mess around with King Su's son? Although they do look good, their identities, statuses, ages, etc. should not be brought together. What is this? Didn't she get this loss in vain and have to grit her teeth to swallow it? Su Buling knew that Xiao Qi's reaction was like this. Bai Gei had to hold it in calmly, otherwise it would not only be a simple family scandal, but the whole world might be in chaos. You're welcome, Miss Xiao. We have just arrived in the capital and should rest more. Su Buletinling walked closer with a friendly look on his face and looked at the good baby who was still obeying his words in his arms last night. To be honest, he felt a little bit unbearable, but at this time he could only pretend to be stupid and wait until he returned to the fiefdom. Xiao Qi's strong mind suppressed the unacceptability in her eyes, lowered her gaze and nodded slightly. Your Majesty, you're welcome. Come into the house. Mrs. Lu secretly smiled in her heart. She was not surprised at all by Miss Xiao's gaffe. She was stunned for a long time when she first met Su Buling. Immediately, he entered the main hall with Su Buling and sat down behind the desk. Although it is a family banquet of the Xiao mansion, the dignity of elders and younger ones is placed here. We ate at separate tables. Prime Minister Xiao Chuang sat at the top, Su Buling took the first place on the right, his legitimate son Xiao Ting sat at the first place on the left, and the only remaining legitimate daughter, Miss Xiao, naturally sat on Su Buling's seat. Order around. This position was deliberately arranged so that Xiao Qi and Su Buling, who had glaring eyes, could communicate. However, at this moment, Miss Xiao wanted to sit in front of her nephew Xiao Ting, let alone watch her words. She even held her breath as much as possible and smelled a lot of I feel restless without the smell on my body. The next step was to exchange cups and cups. Xiao Chuang said some kind words to encourage the juniors, not talking about political affairs. Xiao Ting, on the other hand, looked at his nose and heart more honestly, thinking about where to go tonight. Su Buling's speech and behavior were naturally fine. He greeted the Xiao family members politely and occasionally praised Mrs. Lu for her good discipline. Xiao Qi completely forgot about strategizing in the study, and wanted to observe Su Buling, but when she glanced at Su Buling, she remembered that the young prince looked naked, and quickly turned back. After enduring like this for an unknown amount of time, Xiao Chuang, who was above him, said kindly. Xiao Qi came from Jiangnan just now and has heard about the prince for a long time, but has never seen him. Xiao Qi is proficient in military tactics and strategies, and also has a lot of insights into Anbang's governance. After the banquet is over, the prince can chat more with Xiao Qi. State, maybe it can be used. This was an opportunity to create some solitude, allowing Xiao Qi to take a closer look at Su Buling. Su Buling chuckled and nodded slowly. It's an honor. Xiao Qi frowned slightly. She wanted to say that she was too tired and had no time, but she had already decided on this. It would not be good to regret it suddenly, so she could only nod lightly. Soon, the banquet was over, and Xiao Ting ran out with the maid in a hurry. Xiao Chuang and several uncles went to the study to talk about government affairs. Of course, Mrs. Lu couldn't get in and interrupt, so she went out in a proper manner according to her status as a junior daughter-in-law. Su Buling stood up, looked at Miss Xiao beside him, and bowed slightly. Miss Xiao. Xiao Qi took a breath, her face was still calm, she smiled, and prepared to get up. She sat down on the cushions to eat at a separate table. Maybe she had been sitting for too long, and Su Buling was a little more wild last night and had just stood up a little. Something strange happened, and my legs went weak and I almost fell down. Woo! Su Buling took advantage of the situation and raised his hand to hold Xiao Qi's arm, dragging her up and helping her up. What's wrong? Xiao Qi's body trembled violently, She quickly withdrew her hand, her breathing rose and fell several times, her eyes were always looking at the ground, and she said calmly, "Don't worry, my prince. I'm a little tired after sitting for so long, thank you." Su Buling smiled and raised his hand to signal. Xiao Qi was in a state of confusion and felt a little unsteady. She tried to remain calm and walked to the side hall to sit down and asked the maid to pour 2 cups of tea. Su Buling sat in the side hall, always maintaining a calm and elegant demeanor. It seemed that he really didn't recognize that the Queen Mother last night was Xiao Qi. Xiao Qi was silent for a while holding the teacup. There was no one else in the room. After confirming that Su Buling had no strange expression or eyes, she secretly relaxed a little in her heart. This bastard, he should not have recognized him. Thinking of this, Xiao Qi calmed down a little and said softly, "Your Highness has been in Chang'an for more than a year. What do you think of Chang'an?" Su Buling smiled, "It's good to have Aunt Lu taking care of you carefully." Xiao Qi nodded. Today, she should have used all kinds of language to test Su Buling's mind and scheming, but at this moment, let alone trying to find out Su Buling's bottom line, she was mentally strong if she didn't reveal herself. After a short silence, Xiao Qi felt that sitting here was a waste of time, and his heart was getting more and more confused. He could only raise his hand and rub his forehead. "Alas, I have been traveling thousands of miles these days, and it is really hard to concentrate. How about visiting the prince another day?" Su Buling blinked his eyes. In fact, he wanted to comfort Xiao Qi and say something responsible, but the rainstorm was coming, and some things must not be exposed before the situation was determined. The Queen Mother saved his life, and he would never forget this friendship of sacrificing her life in desperate situations. And the wisest Miss Xiao suddenly came to the capital to visit relatives and talk to him in person. Su Buling also guessed her intention. After thinking for a while, Su Buling smiled and said softly, "Recently, the situation in Dayo and Baiki has changed a lot, which makes people a little confused. Miss Xiao came here, I think she also wants to share Xiao Xiang's worries. I have been reckless since I was a child, and although I don't understand these political schemes, I have heard of a Buddhist Zen saying, which is, seeing mountains as mountains, seeing water as water, seeing mountains not as mountains, seeing water not as water, seeing mountains still as mountains, seeing water still as water. It refers to the 3 levels of life. But in my understanding, it should be mountains are mountains, water is water, it is the same after looking at it. The more you think, the more mistakes you make." Well, the view may be a bit superficial and straightforward, but a wise man should be open-minded to accept advice and ask questions. I think Miss Xiao should not laugh at me. Goodbye first. After speaking, Su Buling stood up, bowed, and walked out of the living room quickly. Xiao Qi was obviously stunned for a moment, frowned slightly, and looked at the back of the man in white as he left. She was a little confused as to why this morally corrupt and insane prince of a vassal state could say such a thing. She had naturally heard of this Buddhist Zen saying. It was just a witty remark, without any meaning at all. It was often used by old monks to pretend to be profound and persuade people. Humph. Xiao Qi did not say goodbye. She frowned and stood up, continuing to think about how to deal with Su Buling's matter. But just after taking a few steps, her body suddenly froze again. It looks like a mountain at first glance, but it is not a mountain at second glance. At last, it is still a mountain is a mountain. The confusion in Xiao Qi's heart was suppressed in an instant. She always felt that this sentence was telling her something, and she couldn't catch it in a short time. Miss Xiao came here to share the worries of Prime Minister Xiao. She came here to take charge of the Xiao family, understand the current situation, and avoid making the wrong move. See the mountain as a mountain, see the water as water. At first, everyone thought that the emperor wanted to reduce the power of the vassal states. The mountain is the mountain, the water is the water. Xiao Qi was shocked, turned around suddenly, ran to the door and looked out, but the man who didn't know if he said this unintentionally had already disappeared in the courtyard. Please give me some monthly tickets and recommendation tickets. If you have any opinions or suggestions, you can just mention them in the group. It is impossible for a book to satisfy everyone, but I have always tried my best to satisfy all book friends. I'm all in today. I'm not sure how many chapters I can update tomorrow. I'll try to write as much as possible. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 270. After the thin and dense drizzle moistened everything, as the rising sun appeared in the sky again, the countryside of Chang'an City turned into midsummer. The sudden increase in temperature dissipated the humidity of the past few days, directly causing the merchants in the streets to the number of soldiers dropped sharply, and by noon the streets were empty. On Zhuangyuan Street, Lu Yunlin, deputy envoy of the Criminal Investigation Department, walked out of the restaurant, smelling of alcohol. Behind him was Tang Xiao, the head of the Tang family in Yuzhou, who was dressed as a scribe in a long robe. Tang Xiao was, as Hua Jingting said, more like an official pursuing an official career than a wanderer. The reason for coming to Beijing this time is to be awarded the title of Ten Wukui, and to raise the reputation of the Tang family in Yuzhou to a higher level. However, how to seal this wukui is obviously a university question. The emperor writing two words casually and doing it in front of the people are two different things. Since Tang Jiao came to the capital, he naturally wanted the emperor to show up and watch him compete with others. Then Longjian Daiyue will give him a military leader. The candidate for this one-on-one challenge must also be suitable, otherwise the court will bring eunuch Jia out to compete with him, and this person will lose his fortune. Therefore, during the days when Tang Jiao came to the capital, he was visiting various places to establish relationships and try his best to sort out the matters surrounding his appointment as Wukui. He even paid a visit to the Xiao mansion on Kuishao Street and had long forgotten about the humiliation he suffered on the road. The back of my head. At this time, Tang Jiao had a friendly smile on his face, as if he were treating an old friend. He walked beside Lu Yunlin, whose status in the world was completely different, and said, "Mr. Zhang was attacked by the thief Zhu Liuyi. Hurt, our Tang family has also been secretly investigating. If we find the fish that slipped through the net, we will personally bring his head to the capital to punish him." Lu Yunlin expressed a warm expression and waved his hand. "Master Zhang is injured and resting at home. I am in charge of selecting the military leader. The head of the Tang family has been famous in the world for many years. There must be one of the 10 military leaders. As for the Holy One coming to observe in person, I don't dare to say it lightly. I have already sent a message to the palace, and there will definitely be a confirmation in the near future." Tang Jiao's face suddenly became a little more eager. He raised his hands and clasped his fists. "Then I will help Deputy Ambassador Lu. Where, it should be." Lu Yunlin smiled and chatted for a few words, then got on his horse and walked out of Zhuangyuan Street. After walking around the street a few times and making sure that no one was following him, he entered a courtyard near the Imperial College again. I know. Summer cicadas make a slightly harsh sound in the peach blossom forest of the Imperial College. The originally bare peach forest has long been transformed into greenery all over the courtyard. Song Yu stood under the eaves of the tea house, sheltering from the scorching sun, while holding a pen and gently sketching on the rice paper. After a while, Lu Yunlin dressed up as a soldier, carried 2 baskets of rice paper into the peach blossom forest, came to the tea house, and took off the hat used to protect his head from the sun. "Your Majesty, it has been arranged. Lu Pingyang and Hans Hongyu can hand over a message to the Holy One at any time and ask the Holy One to come out of the palace, do you think?" Song Yu focused her eyes on the scroll with a dull expression. "Suolonggu likes cold and fears heat. The weather is very hot, and the cold poison is bound to be more ferocious. It has been poisoned for nearly 2 years, and the poison has almost entered the lungs. It is difficult to suppress it with strong alcohol, it's just that Su Buling rarely goes out these days. Look. I can't tell if it's poisonous. I need to find someone to test it first. Once I'm sure that the cold poison can no longer be suppressed and there is no way out, I will throw the things out and ask the emperor to leave the palace. Lu Yunlin nodded, no. Song Yu was silent for a moment, then turned his attention to the bell and drum tower of the Imperial College. There was a scholar lying on a huge carved dragon pillar reading to enjoy the cool air. Has my Kushan done anything unusual recently? Lu Yunlin shook his head. Since Mei Kushan returned to Chang'an, under the supervision of his humble position and Mr. Lu and Han, he has not had any other contact with Su Buling except Longjian Pavilion. Thousands of people watched that day, but they didn't say anything special. On the contrary, Xiao Qi, the eldest lady of the Xiao family, met Su Buling a few days ago. Xiao Qi is very intelligent, but this matter has nothing to do with the Xiao family. There is very little that can be understood and nothing can be seen. When I met Su Buling, I am afraid that she noticed something was wrong. It is better to take action as soon as possible. If the Xiao family also intervenes at this point, the situation is in chaos. No. I will arrange it right away. Lu Yunlin bowed slightly and quickly retreated. It's the end of April in a blink of an eye, and a little while later it will be the 5th day of May. The time of the year when Yang Qi is at its strongest, just like the sun at noon, so May is also called the poisonous May. In Prince Su's mansion, Su Buling meditated in the cool and comfortable stone pavilion of the back house, calming down and carefully regulating his energy and blood. It is not good to detoxify too quickly. It is like a river that has been blocked for more than a year and suddenly removes the stones blocking the river channel. The original river channel has shrunk and dried up, and is suddenly washed away by the raging torrent. If it is not regulated, it will easily become injured. Bone. After coming out of the Xiao family's house last time, Su Buling didn't go out again and was quietly recuperating at home. Locking Dragon Gu likes the cold and fears the heat. It is relatively quiet when the weather is cold, but is as ferocious as a savage beast in the hot summer. Last summer, the poison almost killed him, but Aunt Lu got a lot of ice cubes to use as an air conditioner for him. Only then did he get through all the difficulties and dangers. Why came? Now that the dragon locking goo has been unlocked, there will no longer be the pain of thousands of ants gnawing at the heart. It is easy to leave the capital secretly, but escaping is obviously not advisable. What Su Buling wanted was to be sent out of Chang'an by the emperor in an honest and fair manner. Using his martial arts skills to escape secretly, he would have to stay in Suzhou City and be a coward in his next life. This was not what Su Buling wanted. Therefore, the plan still had to go according to plan. Obviously, the detoxification matter could not be spread out. Resting at home was just a joke, lest the mastermind behind the scenes would find out that the dragon-locking poison had been solved. As for the Queen Mother's baby, she has been very peaceful recently. She is staying in the palace to take care of herself and has not posted any posts asking Su Buling to go and detoxify. According to Su Buling's guess, Xiao Qi should have said something to the Queen Mother's baby after that night. It was impossible to confess, otherwise the Queen Mother's baby would have rushed over and cut him off. It was probably just some insinuations that made the Queen Mother smell something was wrong, so she stayed calm and didn't mess around. Su Buletinling's poison had been almost cured, and if he cured it again, it would be gone, so he didn't go to see the Queen Mother at night, mainly because he didn't dare to go. What happened last time was too ridiculous, and I felt sorry for the Queen Mother's baby. Xiao Qi's reaction was also in line with the identity of a strong woman. She swallowed Ankai without any strange expression and continued to deal with the tedious affairs of the Xiao family that day. She seemed to have forgotten about losing her virginity. But he must have been avoiding snakes and scorpions, and they never saw each other again after that day. Now is a critical juncture, and Su Buling cannot have too much involvement with the Huan and Xiao family. He can only resolve this misunderstanding that is not bad for him until he returns to Suzhou safely. Miss Xiao is 1 year younger than Aunt Lu, only 27, and she is a well-matched family girl. He is now 19 years old, so it shouldn't be a big problem if he is a few years younger. He can just get married, but it's hard for Aunt Lu to explain. Thinking of this, Su Buling frowned and had a headache. Su Wang Suyu was his father, and it was impossible not to admit it regardless of his body or memory. Grandfather Su Lai had a son in old age, and his father was only in his 40s. Like him 22 years ago, he came to Chang'an City to study. His mother-in-law, Princess Su, was a young lady from the Lu family of the East China Sea. She was only 16 at the time and was traveling in the south of the Yangtze River, playing with her 7 or 8-year-old Aunt Lu, who was burning yellow paper. After that, his mother ran to the capital and was chased by his father. Judging from the time, she should have got on the train first and paid for the ticket later. Because his mother gave birth a few months after becoming a princess. At that time, Aunt Lu heard that his mother had come to the capital, so she rushed to the capital to play. As a result, they met a few times and then passed each other. When he was born, Aunt Lu was only 10 years old, and then she married the Queen Mother's baby and Xiao Qi's eldest nephew. Although they are not related by blood and the age difference is not big, if he and Xiao Qi get married, they will naturally be related to each other. King Su calls Mrs. Lu his adopted sister. He called Mrs. Lu aunt. Mrs. Lu calls his wife aunt. King Su called his wife his daughter-in-law. Mrs. Lu called King Su. Mrs. Lu called him. Thinking of this, Su Buletin shuddered. He could already imagine Mrs. Lu holding the scissors, standing beside the bed in the middle of the night, feeling aggrieved. How about letting Aunt Lu break off the engagement? So how do you calculate the matter of worshipping the boss? Too young to count? Somewhat reluctantly. In the stone pavilion, Su Buling rubbed his forehead and fell into a dead end unknowingly.